Hello, everyone. Nice to be here. Nice to be back in New York. I'm excited to talk to you today. Thank you. Very excited to talk to you this evening about Jerome Robbins. He and I overlapped for a number of years in the early part of my career and worked quite intimately on a number of different ballets. There were other dancers that were working with Jerome Robbins more than I was at the time. He certainly had his favorites, but we had interesting overlap. And in this Centennial year, we're about a week away from what would have been his 100th birthday. This seems like a timely topic, and there are insights that were unique to my experience with him. So I thought they would be interesting to share with you. Caroline kindly introduced the dancers that we brought. I'm so pleased to have them with us, and also Christina Siemens, our principal pianist. We will have them out in a few minutes, but first I wanted to sort of frame this discussion that we're going to have this evening. My history is I grew up not far from here, and long before I was born, my grandparents were fans of the New York City Ballet. My grandparents were English, but my grandfather took a job with the United Nations and moved to New York in the late 1940s at the time that the New York City Ballet was just starting up. So there was a strong interest in the choreography of George Balanchine and the dancers of the New York City Ballet. Jerome Robbins was not a mystery to me. My parents got a subscription for my sister and I when we were probably about 7 or 8. We had our own subscription. I know. How lucky were we? So when I was 9, I entered the School of American Ballet, and I was called to a ballet called Mother Goose. It had just premiered the year before, also known as Ma Mère Loy, but it's a series of fairy tales that Robbins created for dancers. And there are 3 small boys in that production. There's a messenger. The tiniest of the boys is known as Hop on My Thumb. And there's Cupid. I got Cupid, which I considered the short straw at that time, mostly because of the costume, but more on that later. But that's when I first encountered Jerry Robbins, and even that first encounter was a somewhat profound coaching experience and sort of signified what our relationship would be for the next, it was 20 plus years that he and I were working together on and off. Tonight we're going to look at 4 solos in particular that he and I worked together on. You may be surprised that one of them is not choreography by Jerome Robbins, it's choreography by George Balanchine, and that is The Prodigal Son. The circumstances around that, I can tell you a little bit later, but Robbins really wanted to have a hand in the coaching of a new young prodigal and to influence what my path would be as a dancer and as an actor at the time that I made my premiere. The other ones that we worked on quite closely, we're going to take a look at the Brown Boy solo. Robbins referred to them as boys and girls. It's not a term that we would use today, but certainly was standard at the time. So the Villela part was known backstage as the Brown Boy part, and he and I worked closely on that. Also, the work that we probably worked the most on was Opus 19, The Dreamer. Many incarnations, many partners throughout the years, and really a piece that Robbins seemed to be extremely attached to, I thought almost in an autobiographical way, and also very willing to challenge dancers on. He really wanted to pull out the absolute best from dancers in that role. So the side of him that's well known as a taskmaster, I felt it the most there. The final solo that we'll look at is from Ives Songs, a work that's still done from time to time by New York City Ballet. This Jerry was choreographing in 1987, and as often happened with Robbins' choreography, he would make material, and he would make much more than what he needed. If you were going to put together a 38-minute ballet, there could be 90 minutes worth of choreography. I think one of his great strengths, and one of the things that perhaps tortured him the most, was his talents as an editor. I think he went back constantly and edited the work that he had created and wanted to find that perfect seamless flow. And one of the most torturous things about being a great editor is wonderful things hit the cutting room floor. A couple of the works, the numbers that were choreographed on me in Ives Songs didn't make it into the final ballet. And also, because Jerry often took more than a year to create it, it was a time when I was moving from a corps member to a soloist, and the company was shifting, and I never performed Ives Songs. But I did have a visit out in Seattle from Jean-Pierre Froelich about 7 or 8 years ago. And he told me that at the end of Jerry's life, he had inquired about certain pieces of Ives Songs that had been cut, and he wanted to know if we had good, clear film footage of them, and he wanted to have a look at it. That's all I heard. I don't know why he wanted to look. I don't know if there was a thought of anything beyond that. I reached out with the help of my assistant, Doug Fullington, to the New York Public Library to check on that footage in anticipation of this lecture. And Robbins was a stickler for having footage, often a GoPro or having different people with a handheld camera in the studio. So the documentation was tremendous and very thorough. There he and I were at a studio. Oddly, it was the Kennedy Center where this was going on. I didn't remember that, but we must have been on tour, and he wanted to keep creating. So we were working on Ives Songs, and there's 3 run-throughs of me doing this solo. So I got it with great excitement, and I looked, and then I was like, oh, that's why it was cut. So, but I think it doesn't deserve to be in a ballet or to be in a performance. That's Robin's decision. I think there are parts of it that are fascinating, and I see how it might not have fit in the flow of the ballet. But at the end of the program, we'll put that together with dancer James Moore and have a look at it. But a little bit on my biography with him. I happened to be at the right time and the right place for Jerome Robbins. First Cupid was a great interaction, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. There were 6 works that he created that were on me, in a sense. I mean, I wasn't the lead necessarily in the works, but the first was the 1983 Glass Pieces. I was just a member of the Corps de Ballet for that. In the premiere, I was just a walker. Walkers go across in the first movement. Eventually, I was dancing in the third movement. But at the time, Robbins was challenged to find dancers to choreograph on. Many dancers had a very full schedule. Many dancers had a difficult performance that night. So the apprentices, which was myself and Sean Savoy, were sent to these rehearsals with Jerome Robbins, and he worked out much of the material that was used in the third movement, which is really dominated by 2 men's dances, on Sean and I, and steps were made on us. And it was a great connection to be able to be sort of the clay that the artist needed to work with. And he would try version A and version B, as you've probably heard, and there was A1, A2, and so on. And all these complex pieces, each one intriguing to him, each one with merit, some worth discarding and some worth remembering and then going back and putting it together. But his process was, I did not work with George Balanchine, but I heard he could knock it out in a subliminal way on the first try. And Robbins was not that choreographer. I recently looked at the number of works that Robbins created. As you know, they lived to be roughly the same age. And Robbins' total works were 54 ballets and 20-some Broadway shows. And the Balanchine catalog is more like 400. So you have a sense of how prolific and how successful at letting things flow Balanchine was. And Robbins was, I think, grappling much more with the creation process. Glass Pieces in 1983. Glass Pieces was a fascinating work in the history of the New York City Ballet. You'll know 1983 is the year that Balanchine passed. The apprentice system at the time, I was an apprentice in January of '83, and you became a company member after you'd performed 3 ballets. On April 30th, I performed my 3rd ballet, which was Mother Goose, and that tipped me into being a company member. There's nothing sort of honorary about it. It's just circumstantial that I was on stage 3 times. April 30th was also the day that Balanchine died, and a pall was cast over the city, really, and certainly over the company. It was a very strange place to come into as a new young artist, having just reached this sort of pinnacle of your education and growth, and then to have that type of ending surround you and that type of sadness. Glass Pieces broke that to some small extent. I think the world realized that there was exciting work still to be done by other choreographers, and it could happen on the New York City Ballet. And it really said that Jerome Robbins was there, committed, and creating brilliant, uplifting work. I was pleased to just be a walker in that. Brahms' Handel followed. I think we have to admire Jerry for recognizing that Twyla Tharp was a huge talent that had not been to the New York City Ballet before, and he invited her in to be a collaborator on Brahms' Handel. we were all given, I was not old enough to drink, but we were all given a bottle of wine because it was a long process choreographing Brahms' Handel. And as a thank you, we all got a bottle of Chardonnay. Um, Pretty exciting for an 18-year-old. But he created a ballet called 8 Lines after that, where smaller cast, which we worked on. Then a series of ballets started that I call like the angel ballets. The first one of those was In Memory Of. In the culminating movement, it was led by 3 angels. I was the first. And another ballet to follow that was Quiet City, where there were 3 angels, one being the archangel. Jerry kindly braided 3 angels. That was Robert Lafosse, Damien Wetzel, and myself, and let each of us have a chance at being the archangel, but really saw us as equal contributors. This was a time in the 80s, as some of you will know, in New York, that was a devastating time when people were being lost to the AIDS epidemic. And Robbins was not exempt from that, losing dear friends and acquaintances and dancers that he had worked with. And I don't know that he would say that these ballets directly related to the AIDS epidemic, but I think the angel ballets had to, in his mind, in New York in the mid and late 80s. In Quiet City, it was the first time that Jerry came up to me at the end of a rehearsal and said, "I'm giving you some material. When you complete the material, show me what's next. Do the next logical body movement. Do what you think would follow that if you were a choreographer." And it was wonderfully empowering as a dancer, because dancers are trained to lift your leg higher, do the step numerous times, the pointing of the foot. There's certainly more to it than that, but that license to be a collaborator, to show that your artistry and your thinking is part of this creation in the studio. The tendency was to pull back and say, "You're the revered choreographer and I will do what you tell me." But he asked for more, which I felt many times that he was empowering me and recognizing what my contribution could be, that the best result would come because everybody in the studio worked towards it, not just his brilliance. There was a long period when Robbins was not working with New York City Ballet. He was drawn by Jerome Robbins' Broadway in the late 80s, reconstructing that show, which was brilliant. Had a good run, not an endless run, because I think because of costs, but those of you that saw it, just a brilliant compilation of his Broadway work. And then the Paris Opera popped up and expressed interest in working with him, and he went himself to stage many works, discovered many new dancers, and we saw less of him at New York City Ballet. He came back because of 2- and 3-part Invention, which is a work that he created on students from the School of American Ballet. I think the notable member of that cast was Benjamin Millepied. The final work that he choreographed was Brandenburg, which I was also in. That was in 1997. It started with a brilliant duet for Nikolai Huba and Lourdes Lopez, followed soon in the choreography process for Pas de Deux for Wendy Whalen and myself. 2 years of creating Brandenburg, which I think Jerry was not happy with Brandenburg and didn't know when he was done. I credit Peter Martins, who came in one day and said, "We're going to have to wrap this at some point because you've been making it for 2 years, and I think we need a premiere date." So he picked one. He picked a grand premiere date. It was like an opening of the spring season. And Jerry was forced to pull it together and finish the ballet. And I think that was the right call, but I'm not sure he was ever happy with it. When the curtain came down after opening night, he came to Wendy and I, and he said, "I know I've had you go off to the left, and I had you turn once to the right and then walk, but I want you to turn just a half a turn next performance and go off to the other side of stage." And just tinkering and not quite content with what he'd done. But fascinating to be in the studio with him, and even his questionings were fascinating to be around and to be a part of. There are many other ballets I worked with him on, piano pieces, Interplay, Four Seasons, Fancy Free, Fanfare, The Concert, I'm Old Fashioned, Andantino. Moves was a fascinating ballet to be a part of. This was a reconstruction. Those of you that know Moves, it was done in 1959 without music. It's just done to the sounds that the dancers make on stage, and they cue one another from those sounds, and they're also sight cues. A bit of I think, a revolutionary piece ahead of its time. He had us listen very closely to the coughing of the audience as a signal to when we weren't being effective enough or the pace wasn't intense enough. So, see, you guys didn't know you were involved, but he was working from you. I think his awareness of an audience and being an audience member himself was also one of his great strengths. But Moves was, I sort of accidentally got in that cast. It was more veteran dancers, and the person that I was watching became injured, so I was able to step into that first cast. Goldberg for many, many years, Opus 19, as we talked about, and ballets that I also didn't perform, other dances, and Afternoon of a Faun. I had the good fortune in later years, this was 1994, of Mark Morris. I'm not sure who the initiator of this was, but it was for Mark Morris's White Oak Dance Project, and there was a solo to be created by Jerry for Mikhail Baryshnikov. And they were both very excited and signed on for this and couldn't wait. But secretly, they were both just panicked to get in the studio with each other that one would disappoint the other. So Jerry said, "Can I spend some time in the studio with you developing material before I go in the studio with Misha?" I said, "I'll get back to you." No, I said, "I'm in." So it was exciting to be a part of that and to work out that material, and also to allow him to exercise that artistic muscle that he had and to find his confidence to be able to go forward. And he made a point of making sure that I was also able to perform that work at one point when it came to New York City Ballet. I only did it once, but I knew I did it at least once because he wanted that to happen. I wanted to tell you a little bit about when we met in Mother Goose, and then a little bit later, I'll have James come out and we'll take a look at Prodigal. But the first thing that I was Cupid, which is, as I said, it's not a great thing because Cupid has large pink wings on his back, and it was bad when I was 10, but then I had to do it again when I was 11, and I finally, at 13, I think I begged to get out of Cupid, but I was told, well, Mr. Robbins loves you in it, so. But the first rehearsal that I was there, there's a real nervousness in the room. You could just feel it. You could feel everybody in the room with this tension, the way people were walking around, the way that people were talking with the pianist, the energy of people coming in and out and understudies going over parts. And then we get to the moment where Cupid enters, which is at the end of the ballet, and there's that familiar clap, or actually with Jerry more often it was a whistle. He just would whistle, which was the signal for the pianist to stop. And he came over to me, and more nervousness in the room. But suddenly the room fell away, and I think other people in the room might have felt this, because he got to my level. He talked to a 10-year-old boy who was riveted by what he was about to say. And he said, "When you lead Prince Charming from here to the fairy princess over there, you have to clear the reeds," which looked a lot like watermill. And he said, "You have to clear the reeds, not just with your arm, but you have to clear them with your body." And that sort of extra effort of the body going somewhere made a whole different type of inertia and spell that I was casting. And the most telling thing for me was, the first thing he said was, "Remember, you're an Indian scout." Some grandfather works for the UN, so I was like, is it from India or is it a Native American scout? But I didn't ask because I went with the latter. But he said, every time you put your foot on the earth, you make sure there's no twig that would break underneath your foot. And suddenly the way that Cupid had to walk across the stage was different. And that kind of coaching, I think another coach that wasn't as successful would have said, no, again, softer, too fast, no. But don't break a twig under your foot was something that any dancer or actor could work with. And particularly a 10-year-old boy, it registered for me. And it was like one person who had once been a 10-year-old boy talking to another person who was there. And then I realized that there was going to be this level of coaching that was probably not like anyone else that I was going to encounter in my career. So I will ask Christina Siemens to come on out. In a moment, we'll take a look at some of Prodigal Son. James, I'll have you hold off for just a second. When we did Prodigal, this was not long after Balanchine passed away, a couple of years. They hadn't had a new Prodigal Son for a while at New York City Ballet. Balanchine had coached them himself. The other person that also coached Prodigal Sons was John Terrace, and he had recently retired from New York City Ballet. So we were really without a person to coach that role. Rosemary Dunleavy was stepping in valiantly. She'd always been in charge of the goons, but hadn't worked particularly closely with the prodigals, except in group rehearsals. So, as often happens at City Ballet, my name went up on casting for a week from then, and I saw a conversation going on between Jerome Robbins and Peter Martins, and then Peter came over to me first and said, "Jerry would like to coach you in The Prodigal Son. Are you okay with that?" And I said, "I'll get back to you." No, I said, "Yes, that would be amazing." And Peter explained to me that Jerry had been the first Prodigal Son for the New York City Ballet and had worked quite closely with Balanchine. I think the part was dear to him. How could it not be to any male dancer? But particularly because he was an actor and had worked with Stanislavski method and worked on Broadway shows and been around so many actors and revered the craft so completely. So when we started the work, even the moment I entered, he stopped immediately and he said, "Okay, what did you have for breakfast?" Do you know this story? Do you know where I'm going? So I thought, I didn't realize where he was going, but I thought, I did go to McDonald's and I did have an Egg McMuffin. So I told him an Egg McMuffin. And he said, "No, you completely have misunderstood. I don't care where Peter Boal had breakfast. What time did the prodigal wake up? What time does the prodigal's father wake up? How long ago did you plan this trip? What have you heard about the siren who lives over the hills? What are you and your two friends able to carry with you on this journey?" I mean, all this stuff, all this homework, all this invitation to flesh out a character beyond, I thought you entered on the count of 3, but he had this, just like Cupid, you couldn't walk through the reeds. You had to walk with a purpose and an intention in order to heighten the experience that an audience would have. James, we're ready for you. Come on out. Why don't we start by showing how my first rehearsal with Jerome Robbins went. You would be off stage. Christina will play the opening, and I'll tell you roughly when I got stopped. How bad could I be? But anyway, apparently I was, but we started the fleshing out of that. We talked through a lot of characterizations. Some of the things that he pointed out was the greeting of the friends. They were friends, but also there was a bit of a hierarchy. He wanted me to feel that in my approach. There are things that James picks up, that the prodigal picks up. I would pick them up like this, but they were jugs of wine, so he wanted me to pick them up in a way that you would pick up a jug of wine. Had I seen my inheritance before? Had I had greed over it? Or was this the first time that I was seeing it? Is there delight? Is there calculation behind what I'm receiving? But this very detailed layers of what we do. One of the things James and I can look at is there's sort of a space on stage, which Jerry pointed out, which he said was the sacred, that's where the family had prayer every morning there. That's where the father would call the sisters, and we would come and we would kneel. There's a moment when James kneels, the father forces him to, and he wanted to see the resentment building, but we can't see his face at all, so he wanted to see it in the back. So, and even through a rehearsal shirt, you can feel what a dancer can do there. And then when you see the costume, you'll see even more. At one point, James stands up while the father is praying. And as he stands up, the fist comes early so that the audience knows what's going to happen. This is sacred prayer circle, and then James' next move goes right in there and defiles it, which couldn't be a more hurtful thing for the father to see. A couple of other things. He wanted, when the prodigal first entered, he wanted him to run to, there's a fence over there, as many of you know, that restricts the property, and he wanted him to run to the fence and almost float beyond it with this tremendous desire to get further away. Yeah, and then he'll go on to see his friends. At the end, he jumps over the fence, and he wanted that to be the most euphoric breakthrough. The tendency, I don't know if you felt this, but you want to look down when you jump over the fence because it's big and you don't know where you're going to land. But can you give us a flying euphoric jump? Yeah, he wanted that image to be emblazoned in you, the audience. And you almost become the Greek chorus because you know that it's a failure to have that much euphoria at what you're about to do. And then you know that he will later regret it. Should we do it? All right, let's give you a moment to get dressed in the costume, and then we'll take a look at Prodigal Son. Another thing that he asked of me, which I thought was, again, sort of empowering, was to find the other characters and to work with them, to find the sisters that I was going to have and to go over with them how I wanted to turn, what the challenges should look like. Find your father. Talk about the way that you would like him to pick you up or the way that you want him to wrap your arm around. So there was this almost like you need to start to become a director and an actor. To go beyond what your role is and look at what the whole ballet is and what the whole production is and what the audience sees. And the protagonist is the one that has to be the director in this case. So we'll take a look at James doing this solo. I'm going to sub in for the father, if you can picture a long white beard. And this is going to be just when the sisters grab him, and then he starts his first solo. Good. I've never seen James look at me so angrily before, but that's good acting for you. This second solo Robbins reminded me was very different because the first one was done behind the father's back when a young man can spout off and show his anger. And the second one is really hurtful because it's done to the face with the father's knowledge. So this is the true breaking of the bond. But as you know, the father forgives. At the end, Robbins was really insightful about the return at the very end of the ballet, the very last entrance. One way that I probably played it in my first rehearsals was to try to show the audience the tragedy and the misery that I'd been through in the way that I walked with the staff, putting angst and effort and sadness and exasperation into every movement. And he said, take it all out. That makes no sense. What you would do after days on end of walking without water is nothing, the minimal, only enough to move the stick forward, only enough to drag your knee over the dirt, no extra efforts. And this was, you want to do more, and I think it's very hard to realize that when the canvas is blank and that first coat of color goes on or that first stroke of the brush, it can be so powerful. So to try to erase all of the extra and just take the audience into neutral, and then when you do choose to add drama, it just heightens the experience so effectively and tremendously. You'll see that when James comes back. And then one of the things that stuck with me for 19 years of doing Prodigal Son was Jerry wanted you to arrive at this place where you did your periodic sort of looking up to see where you were, and you saw a fence, a gate. And it looked remarkably like the one that you grew up with. But you don't know for sure. You have to, in Jerry's mind, do the analysis is, if the fence is there, my house would be. And that's when the moment comes. And the speed of that sentence is what he knew an audience would need. The tendency would be, fence, house, I made it. And that isn't the effect that the end of Prodigal Son should be. So deliberately slowing down as a dancer or as an actor would create a process in your mind where you could wholly connect each piece that was being presented and feel the full impact of that emotion. Should we take a look? Okay, you have your staff. Good, all right, this is James returning to home. Thank you, James. We'll see you soon. um, yeah, the beauty of this, there's films of Balanchine doing this, but Jerry was, he cleared the room for all the rehearsals with me. We worked only for a week, but every single day. Nobody was allowed in the room. And Jerry would get on the floor with the staff and demonstrate these moments. He was an incredible demonstrator, wholly committed. And his demonstration, as good as his words were, his demonstrations were even better. I still see him in those things. And I suspect it wasn't easy for him to be on the floor at that age, but the level of commitment to what we were trying to accomplish was so important that he would. We're going to take a look at Dances at a Gathering now. There was a period when, for some reason, Jerry wanted to teach the opening solo of what we call the Brown Boy. He wanted to teach it himself. He certainly had people that could have taught it, but he felt it was important to have that with these new casts. The new casts that he wanted to work with were Jeff Edwards and Damien Wetzel and myself. And he taught us every step from scratch. None of us did the part for a couple of years, but I don't think that was the point. I think he just was taking an advance here and wanting to make sure that he directly passed information on, whether we did it in the next couple of years or whether he was around or not. He wanted to convey this information. I'm going to bring Lucien Postlewaite out here, and we'll talk through this a little bit. The first thing that happens in this solo is he enters from downstage left. We're just going to put him on that carpeting over there. It's great in this theater because Robbins' concept was that he is you. He is every man, he is every woman, he is a person that has emerged from the audience. And the differences between the formally trained dancer and you are very few. And this is not about how high your legs go, this is about what you feel. But he wanted us to enter the space sort of, again, undramatically, just as a pedestrian walking onto the space. And this space, he said, was the beaches of Normandy that somebody hadn't been back to in decades. It was the playground that you grew up on. It was the ballet studio where you had your very first lessons. And then he pulled on the ballet studio. He said, when you get there, you would look over there and you would see where your best friend stood at the bar. And then you'd remember that your rival, the other best dancer in the class, stood over there. And then you would remember that the teacher entered over here. And by then, you were drawn into the space. And then the movements that you had first learned started to come back. He said they were rusty. He said you had to just etch through this sort of age of deterioration and find it. And you could just see the essence of it. This moment that Lucien just did is the first of a series of what he called ghosts. And he would have, why don't you do that one more time, that second balancé. He would go up to the corner and he would have screamed, Lucien, and then you would turn, or Peter, and that's how, or Jeff, or Damien, but that's how he got us to see that. And those were unexpecteds that we didn't know were in the room with us. Another ghost, maybe military is the next one. There's a place where he said it's called military in the score, and it's where you took out your old jacket. You can pick your World War II jacket that you put on for the first time, and you look at the epaulets in the mirror and maybe the decorations that you've earned. And it's just a moment there, but it has a grandeur to it that makes you see it differently if you know the artist's intention. He liked the word doodle, as one might do with a pad of paper and a pen, just creating different things. There's a section that's called Doodle that comes up right after this. And it's experimentation. It's like a choreographer in his studio alone, and he's testing positions, and he doesn't know where he's going to go, and he's testing timings and flexibilities and play, turn in, turn out. Yeah, and that's doodle. But he liked this concept. He liked the randomness, the calculated, choreographed, tightly scripted, but it appeared random to you. The final ghost will come at the end after a huge menage of jetés. We were also saying that, as you can imagine, this stage is smaller than the stage that dances is usually done on, so we've done some slight accommodations to the spacing to be able to make sure that it fits. The final moment, Lucien will work to defy gravity almost like Icarus in places, really lofting high with his arms and his gaze, and seeming to rediscover youth and all these things that he may not have had when he walked on. And he'll come down to this corner. A final ghost will call his name, and you can just show that gesture. And then he turns so that you can see his face, and in a sense he says, "Did I just imagine it all?" And off he goes. All right, speaking of off he goes, he's going to put on the proper costume so you can see it in costume. There's another moment with the brown boy, and people ask me, we just finished a great Jerome Robbins festival with Pacific Northwest Ballet where we did 7 of his works. Dances at a Gathering was one of them. And people were saying, well, what did Jerry say about the epilogue when the brown boy comes back and touches the ground? And I think he didn't say much to me. I think when it was right, he didn't need to say much, and if it was wrong, he certainly would have. But he said, press your palm into the earth, feel the vibrations, and think about all that has transpired on this spot. And I think it speaks for every time the ballet is done. There's stuff happens between people, with people, it's witnessed, it's felt, there's love, there's loss, there's memory, and it all happens every day right where we are. Okay, we don't quite have a costume. The other thing that comes into much of Robbins' choreography is character dancing. Dances at a Gathering is ripe with it, some places much more overtly than others. But the brown boy has it. You're going to see it in Lucien's arm. You saw it in the military jacket. And you also see it in places in Opus 19, The Dreamer, which we'll look at a little bit later. But all right, we'll take a look at the brown boy solo. We were spacing this earlier, and I actually think it, despite from not being able to see the full impact of that jumping circle at the end, I love that he enters almost from the audience and exits back into the audience. It seems so fitting. Jerry loved this place in the stage. You'll see the Ives Songs solo starts from there, Opus 19, The Dreamer starts there, and also Dances at a Gathering. So we're going to move into Opus 19, The Dreamer, in a minute. I was thrilled to come to this role. It was a really weighty role. I had been sitting in the audience as a 12-year-old when it premiered, so it had a special place in my heart all those years. I wasn't called to it in my first years, but I was very happy when I finally was. My first rehearsal with Jerry didn't go well. I was taught the work by Bart Cook, and Jerry was brought in to see it. And I ran through these first 4 minutes that you'll see from Dylan Wald in a minute. And Jerry stopped and said, it's not enough. You're not deeply invested enough. So you're not ready, and I'm not gonna cast you in it. And yeah. It's like, wait, that's not in my plan. I've been playing this since I was 12. So he started to leave, and he got halfway out the door, and I said, Jerry, wait, I know I can do this. You have to give me a second chance. It was one of those moments in life where I just couldn't let him get out that door because I knew it was in there. I knew I could meet him for what he wanted from the role. So he was probably hoping I'd do that. It was probably a test knowing him. But he did come back and sit down again and let me have a second shot at it, which I tell you the second time was way better than the first time. And then we worked on it for many years. He never quite let me off the hook with Opus, never took it for granted, which I appreciated, just always pushed me on it. I'll bring Dylan out here and we'll look at a couple of the things that we talked about. So first of all, you'll see these parallels between the three works that we're looking at tonight. When Dylan starts, he starts down here, and he is so separated. He really is you to some extent, and the rest of the cast is way further upstage. He starts with a simple arm gesture, and these become like a theme in the ballet. This happens 3 different times in the ballet. Each time is slightly different, but this is the theme before the variations, and there's sort of an inertia and a calm and a dreamlike state with a little bit of fracture and distraction in there. As he wanted energy to fly off of each arm on these lunges, sort of sending out signals, and eventually it's sending out the ballerina whose energy flies off those arms simultaneously. The ghosts came back in much of what my work with him was. And this he described as pushing demons away behind you. Each one of them is rejecting something from the past that you want to be rid of. In this particular gesture, you look back just to make sure before you go on. But those creep in everywhere. One of the other things that you'll see in the Ives solo, there's a push that Dylan does where Jerry wanted it held much beyond human capability. Would stop me every time to say, more, it's not off balance enough. I want to see you come so close to falling. Why don't you give us a couple of those? Yeah, and there's just that moment when he should fall, and that becomes the choreography. And I've seen on myself and others when you underplay that, it is undervalued, and it needs all that Jerry was insistent on putting in there. There's also analogies that he would create. There's a moment before Giselle where he told us we were looking into the abyss. Comes out of nowhere, and we just see this kind of awakening and opening. Later, there's a point when you finished your spins and you're walking up stage, and there's a music change, and we're supposed to see a slight reaction in the dancer's back, according to Jerry, and that is the moment when 4 women enter the stage, and it's been men before that. But the women entering has a different effect on this male protagonist, and we don't know if it's a better effect, a comforting effect, or a haunting effect. But he pointed that out several times. There is also this little bits of what he referred to as either Russian peasant dancing or ethnic dancing, maybe from the attitude. And these little bits of character flair that happen, they seem almost out of place in the ballet, but I think they certainly wouldn't have with Misha Brezhnikov, who was the first cast of it. I think they were just sort of built in. But they are everywhere, and there are places for everybody in the cast to do that. And the last thing was there's a sort of paddle turn or a chaîné at the end that's repeated by Dylan and then the other men in the corps de ballet. Jerry said it was a great big chain that we were dragging, almost like a Sisyphus, something we were trying to rid ourselves of that we were unable to do so. So we're going to look at the opening of Opus with Dylan, and then we're going to also look at a little section from the end. So I'll give him a minute to get into his costume. As I said, Jerry kept on me about this. One of the last conversations that we had was he saw the performance and arranged to speak to me on the phone about it, and he said, you got to watch Wendy Whalen. She's about to take this ballet from you. So it's like, not going to let that happen. So, but it was really good advice because it needed that. And I needed to keep upping my game. It was never quite enough. The best moment I probably had with Jerry was after one Opus, which was not my last. He came backstage afterwards, and there were just tears coming down his face. And I think I heard a quote from Misha saying that he thought this ballet was somewhat autobiographical for Jerry, but he just walked up to me and didn't say anything and just tipped my head forward and gave me a kiss, touched me on the shoulder, and that was all I needed. So I knew at least once I got it right. But well, let's have Dylan take a look at the opening. As I said, the arms that we saw are sort of provide a theme in the ballet. The last time they come back, I think, is the most powerful time that we see them. That time they are completely fractured into a million pieces, and we almost can't decipher the original pattern that we saw Dylan do earlier. Again, this is Jerry wanted the randomness. He wanted you to have a different version every day. He wanted it to look like it was uncontrollable for you. It was something that happened without your intention. It just happened to you. He didn't mind the involvement of the breath being sort of spasmodic in that process. But why don't you just walk us through the arms without music? They start with that same two-arm theme that we have. And from there, yeah. It becomes like a physical unraveling of a continuity that we've known before. And this is the dreamer coming out of the dream state or the nightmare state. We'll take a look at that. He goes back to a wonderful continuity where he's actually delving and cutting through the air to get back to different places. So let's try that with music. So as I said, gratitude towards Daisy Palmer with the New York Public Library, who was able to locate these three films of Ives Song and send them to me so that I could look at it. The reconstruction process wasn't challenging. Once we got over the shock of what my hair looked like in the 80s, we were back to normal, but it was a little shocking. There was great work done on this. I can't remember other numbers that were cut. I know they would be filmed. There was a great number that was led by Bart Cook. It was called General Booth, I think. Bart had these great sweeping gestures, and the corps de ballet would follow him blindly whatever he did, and it felt really like a dictator or someone who influences minds leading a group. But this solo I thought was interesting. It's a very short solo. It's only about 2 minutes. Jerry made probably about 5 different numbers on me, and this was the one that stuck with me the most. It was pretty much as I remembered it when I saw the tape, though there was a little more detail in the dancing. I really just remembered certain upper body movements. Why don't we have James come out, and we'll talk through it a little bit. Again, our usual starting place, he would start way down there at the very first wing, right at the proscenium. The premise is that he is on a raft. It's called Farewell to Land, and he is unable to control that raft, and it is drifting farther and farther from the land. Christina, as you now know, is a very talented pianist. She is also a beautiful soprano, so she's going to sing the Ives lyrics that you'll hear. These are written by Byron. This is how they go. Adieu, adieu, my native shore, fades o'er the waters blue. The night winds sigh, the breakers roar, and shrieks the wild sea mew. Yon sun that sets upon the sea, we follow in his flight. Farewell a while to him and thee, my native land, good night. So James, when he comes out, he starts with this quiet inertia of a drifting raft, and it doesn't really stop the whole solo. He's going to go from downstage left to upstage right, and he's yearning to get back to the land that he can't. And the feet are meant to be completely imperceptible, almost like you would just focus on the upper body and we wouldn't see the negotiations going on in the feet. There are moments later where the raft does sort of circles, like he's caught in an eddy and the water is going around and round. It's actually kind of harder to do on land, but he can't control the path of the raft, and it goes one way and the other. Not long after that, we have these great swells that sound like waves that come up, and you'll hear it in Christina's voice and the music, and then James' body echoes these uncontrollable waves that lands him back where he started. And in the end, we'll see him far upstage, right, and he has the similar arms that he started with, but there's almost like a resolution. He's protecting himself, but I think he's also building what he can of a coffin as we see him go away forever. Jerry had a lot of happy works, but he didn't call me. I got all like the depressing, lonely ones. But I actually think it was a real part of who he was as a person, as an artist. There were parts of him that were tortured and tormented, and I think he was so brilliant and happy. I mean, I love a ballet like Interplay and Fanfare and Fancy Free and Four Seasons, and there's so much uplifting. But I also think he was a complete artist and a complete human, and these aspects to life he wanted to show, and the places where we feel the desolation and we feel the powerlessness, represented by Byron or Ives or channeled through Robbins, and I was proud to be there and to be part of it. So why don't we take a look at Farewell to Land? Never performed before. You're the first audience to see it, so may never be performed again. I thought archivally it was interesting to see the types of things that were going on that Jerry didn't want to bring to an audience, and yet there's value in the material So I thought it was an opportunity that we had to bring it back. That is the conclusion of our talk tonight. I hope I come across showing I have a tremendous reverence for Jerome Robbins. I really value the work that he did and the generosity that he wanted to bring to the people that he was collaborating with. I joined a company of 114 at New York City Ballet. It's now a more reasonable size at 90. He wasn't working with everyone. He was working with about 30 and probably quite closely with about 15. And the offering was profound, and I think those 15 felt it. I want to give a special thank you to Christina Siemens, who plays and sings so beautifully. We have a team backstage also that you can't see. I want to thank Works in Process for their work, along with Lorraine Haskell and Doug Fullington and Sandy Barrick, who are back there. And I'll just ask our three dancers to come back out, Lucien, Dylan, and James, and take a final bow. So.